The standard scholarly view of how the traditions about Jesus reached the evangelists when they were writing their Gospels is the view that form criticism proposed early in the 20th century. And the view is that the eyewitnesses who heard Jesus speak, who saw the events of his life, presumably started the traditions off. But then there began a whole process of these traditions passing through the oral traditions of the early Christian communities until eventually they were tapped by the evangelists. And during that process, of course, anything could happen. And there have been different ways of reading it. Some people managed to read it in a fairly conservative way, as though the tradition preserved the traditions pretty well. But the form critics and the real disciples of the form critics tend not to think that, because they stress that the communities and the oral tradition was not really interested in history. So they have no real motive for preserving traditions about Jesus accurately. Their motives are much more to adapt and add to and kind of create freely traditions about Jesus and add them to the traditions. And that's why, on the form critical view, you need, if you are going to say something about the historical Jesus, you need criteria to distinguish authentic material in the Gospels from inauthentic material. And that's the way a whole lot of Gospel scholarship has gone. It's been very widely agreed now, I think, that the Gospels were biographies in the sense of ancient biography. This has been debated, but that's becoming the prevailing view, I think. Not in the sense of modern biographies, of course. We have to rule out all kinds of things that modern biographers do. The kinds of things an ancient biographer did are what are appropriate to the Gospels. But further than that, I think we have to see them as contemporary biographies, in the sense they were written while there were still eyewitnesses around. And this is extremely important, because the way the ancients thought about history, the writing of history, is that you could only write good history within living memory of the events. And they distinguished real history in that sense. Real history has to be contemporary history. And it's because they didn't have all the kinds of archives and all the kinds of sources and so forth that modern historians had. What mattered for them is that they themselves either had been a participant in the events themselves, and that of course was the best thing of all, or alternatively they'd actually been able to interview eyewitnesses of the events. So the Gospels, I think, fit within that category that people would expect to be good history. They would expect it to be reliant on eyewitnesses. And they would, I think, be alert to indications in the Gospels of what the eyewitness sources of those Gospels were. The form critics regarded the Gospels as folk literature. And this is why they were insistent on a long process of oral tradition. They were thinking of the kinds of traditional literature that's passed down orally in societies over the generations. And that accounts for a lot of the way they thought about the Gospels, and it's partly why they denied that the Gospels are history or biography. They're folk literature. But I think most scholars now think that was a mistake. And if you compare the Gospels with the literature of their time, they turn out to resemble biographies best of all. So I think we have to rethink that whole idea of what kind of thing the Gospels are, and if people would have expected them to be historical, if that's the kind of literary genre they would have identified when they first read or heard the Gospels, then I think we've got to apply the kind of expectations that ancient readers and hearers of historiographical literature would have expected. We have these fragments of Papias' lost work, sadly lost work. It would have been extraordinarily interesting if we have it, but we have just these fragments, one of which describes the way in which he himself collected gospel traditions for his own book. And although he's writing in the early 2nd century, we're not quite sure when, he must be describing what he was doing in around the 80s, around the time when the Gospels were being written. So there's very good evidence of how someone saw gospel traditions around the time when the Gospels were written. And what Papias says is that he learned traditions either from the elders who were teaching in his area or people passing through and visiting. But what he would always ask them was, have you any teaching from one of the apostles? Have you got something that Matthew said or something that John said? And Papias, in other words, seemed to think of all traditions as attached to specific names, so they weren't anonymous. The passage has often been read as meaning that Papias preferred oral tradition to written texts, and this I think has been a very influential misunderstanding. What Papias prefers is stuff that's straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. Stuff from the apostles who were still living or who'd recently died. And oral tradition for him is more valuable because it comes from these living sources, not because it's oral rather than written. This group of disciples whom Jesus set aside as in some way having a special role, the 12, and doubtless he thought of them as the leaders of the new Israel representing the 12 tribes. But one special thing about the 12 is that they're all disciples who had been with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry, probably from when he was baptized by John, right through to his death, and they were witnesses of resurrection appearances. And this seems to have been the criterion of a full witness to the life of Jesus. The people who remembered this or that event, this or that saying, of course, were doing something significant for the early church, but they also wanted figures who had been around over the whole course of the events and could give, as it were, a sense of the whole story. The 12 were the obvious people to do this, and they were also the authorities of the church in Jerusalem, the mother church of the Christian movement. So I think it's very likely that the 12 apostles would have been the first people to promulgate kind of official versions of the tradition. They would at some stage in the early history of the Jerusalem church, I think, collected traditions, sorted out their own traditions into some kind of official form. And I think that's also reflected in the way that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke give a very careful and detailed list of the 12. Most of the 12, of course, don't appear individually in the Gospel narratives, so we wouldn't have heard of most of them were they not for this list. And I think the Gospel writers are saying, in a sense, these are the credentials of the witnesses from whom the overall bulk of the traditional material we're writing has come from. There's an interesting phenomenon in the Gospels which people have not paid much attention to, which is about the names given to characters in the Gospels. People in the Gospels who play important roles, like the 12 apostles and Mary Magdalene and so forth, are of course named, and that's what we would expect. But if you turn to the minor characters in the Gospels, people who perhaps just crop up in one story, they meet Jesus on one occasion, they are healed by Jesus on one occasion. Most of these characters in the Gospels are anonymous. And again, that's what we might well expect. But what doesn't fit that pattern is that a number of these minor characters do in fact have names. And it's worth just thinking about why should that be? Why should just a few of these characters be named by the evangelists when the standard practice was obviously that they're left anonymous, and presumably the evangelists didn't know the names of the various people who were healed by Jesus, for example. And I think the explanation of this, which holds most plausibility, I think, is that these people, such as Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, or Jairus, the father of the girl who was raised from the dead, these people became members of the early Christian communities, and they themselves told these stories, their own stories, what had really changed their lives, highly significant events for them, their encounters with Jesus. And they told these stories quite naturally, but more and more, of course, they would be asked to tell their story. And so when these stories passed on to other churches or to the writers of the Gospels, they would have these names attached to them. So that these particular cases, Bartimaeus, for example, this is how Bartimaeus told his own story.